In this video, we're going to look at cognitive load theory and the way that this informs our decisions for our online and hybrid course design. So cognitive load theory. This is a model of memory, and it's specifically used to talk about constructing learning experiences. In this model of memory, a learning experience has three components: the intrinsic load, the germane load, and the extraneous load, and we'll look at each of those. So the intrinsic load of a subject, it's inherent to the subject under study, and then it has a lot to do with how much connectivity there is within the subject. And every subject is going to have components that have high intrinsic load and components that have lower intrinsic load. Another way to think about this is with complexity. So I'm going to give you a quick example. In language study, you have word pairs. So ni hao means hello. So word pairs have a pretty low intrinsic load. You know the word in one language, you learn the word in another language. However, grammar has a very high intrinsic load. It's complicated, has lots of different components, is often contextual, and has lots of exceptions. So grammar is something with a high intrinsic load. Germane load has to do with the learning of the subject and the material. And unlike intrinsic load, which is usually assumed to be inherent to the subject, germane load is something that can be manipulated, that is under your control, because germane load has to do with learning and how learning experiences are structured. So this is the level of relevant cognitive activity necessary to learn a subject. And the goal of these activities is for learners to incorporate new knowledge into a schema. So that could be to create a new schema or to incorporate new information into an existing schema that they already hold. And germane load often has to do with the way that you create and structure assignments for students to help them work through materials and process those materials and show their learning. What's key here, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, is that this is relevant cognitive activity, that the learners are investing in that process of understanding the material. Extraneous load is in many ways the opposite of germane load. So this is the cognitive effort that the learner needs to put in that does not directly lead toward the desired learning outcome. An example of this is if in our language class, a student is trying to memorize word pairs and is looking at the Moodle course page and cannot find the handout that lists those word pairs that they need to study, and they're spending a lot of time scrolling through the page or looking through files and maybe getting frustrated, that's all extraneous load. So that's all cognitive effort that the student is investing that is not leading toward the desired learning outcome. What does this mean for our online and hybrid course design? To sum up this very brief overview of cognitive load theory, when you're thinking about designing a learning experience for your students, and your Moodle course design is certainly that, you should always seek to minimize extraneous cognitive load. So anything that is not directly leading towards students achieving those learning outcomes, really consider if that's necessary or not. And then think about the intrinsic cognitive load of your subject or your unit or your assignment. So how complex is the subject? And the higher the intrinsic load, the more complicated it is, make sure you're carefully structuring that experience for students. And you might do that through segmenting. So if you have a very complex assignment, you might ask students to complete it in parts and give them feedback along the way. But you really want to make sure that you think about that as you're designing your course experience, because every piece of your course, every piece of your subject will have a different level of intrinsic load and therefore needs a different approach when structuring that experience for students. Let's look at some quick, specific examples of how this could apply to your online and hybrid course design. Here's an example Moodle course, and full disclosure, designed in a way to highlight some of these non-ideal course design decisions. So we're thinking about cognitive load theory and the germane load, so things that are leading directly towards students working toward those learning outcomes, and then extraneous load. Anything in the course or about the course design that is not directly helping students achieve those outcomes. So I open my course and immediately see sort of a big image, and I have announcements, a course overview with a schedule and due dates, another bulletin board, this, which is attendance and participation, and then the syllabus. Read this first. Click here to read the syllabus for this course. So if I'm a student in the course and I'm trying to figure out how to begin or where to start, this is probably not an ideal setup, right? So the syllabus, read this first. If this is truly what we want students to do first, why not put it first? Or write out clear instructions for students? Because if we don't do that, if we don't give students clear instructions or let them know how to navigate the course, then they're investing cognitive energy into the learning that has nothing to do with the learning outcomes. And we don't want them to exhaust their energies on figuring out how to navigate the course or how an assignment works. So we're scrolling down the page and really there isn't much sort of signaling for students here about something. And then after all of this at the top, we get to a section called Getting Started. Our syllabus is here again. And then clearly this is important because it's highlighted, but if we made some different design choices, if we had segmented this or perhaps used numbering or written instructions from the very beginning or created a video for students, we probably don't need to have big text highlighted on the page. It's probably not necessary. You'll notice as we look through the page that week 1 is clearly labeled with a date, but then we have topic 2. And most likely the faculty member just sort of forgot to make that change. And again, this is just an example course. But imagine for a student that you're getting used to this format of knowing what week you're in and what content is associated with that week, and then suddenly you have a topic or you have some different formatting. All of that is going to make it more difficult for students to really focus in on the learning and the assignments and the materials that you need them to focus in on. So you want to reduce this extraneous load as much as possible. And lastly, think about things like images and how that relates to the course. So I think images are great to incorporate, but make sure they're relevant. Because again, if a student looks at this course and is wondering why are there dogs in party hats that are sort of pixelated at the top of this course, it might be a cute image, but it's really not doing anything to help balance and really capitalize on that germane load that students need to invest in their learning. It becomes extraneous. That was a very quick example of how cognitive load theory could apply to some of the basics of your Moodle course design, but you can really think about this in terms of every aspect of your course design. So when you're creating an assignment and writing instructions for students, think about what is the intrinsic load of this subject matter and how complicated is it and how highly do I need to structure this activity for students? What is the germane load here and what is extraneous? What can I cut that isn't directly leading to the learning outcomes? So to wrap up, consider intrinsic load in every element of your course design and the materials you're creating for students. How complex is the subject that you're asking them to engage with, and therefore how highly structured do you need to make that learning experience for them? Prioritize germane load so that you can help students process that complex information and design assignments in a way that will help them work through them step by step. And minimize extraneous load. So anything that isn't directly leading to those learning outcomes or helping students to demonstrate their learning and their mastery of the subject matter, get rid of it. Because if students are investing cognitive energy in trying to figure out how to work their way through the course or trying to figure out something that isn't quite as clear as it could be in your assignment instructions, then they are not investing that cognitive energy in learning the content of your course. Thanks for watching, and if you ever have any questions about this or anything else, send us an email at moodlehelp@berkshirecc.edu.